Hello then, welcome to the brief. It's a Thursday, of course, it's the end of the week. It's Friday, and I'm Jessy Chahal. Thank you so much for being with me. As usual, I'll be joined by crisis management analyst Peter NICOLL on the propaganda bubble between Ukraine and Russia, the war that is happening there. And later, I speak to respiratory physician Dr. HELMY MYDIN to get his perspective on the proposed tobacco and smoking control bill, which is now often being touted as the generational end game. We'll break this down further towards the mid section of the program. Do stick with us. But of course, as usual, let's head into what's happening locally. Here's the news in brief. The 2021 UMNO General Assembly will begin with the hoisting of the party flag at Plaza Merdeka, World Trade Center, Kuala Lumpur this morning. The ceremony began with the Wanita UMNO chief, followed by youth chief and Putri chief, with their flags of respective wings, accompanied by songs of their movements. Now, the UMNO president then hosted the party flag Sang Saka Bangsa, accompanied by the singing of the UMNO song Bersatu, Bersetia, Berkhidmat. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister says calls for the 15th general election have yet to be discussed within UMNO. According to him, the matter should be deliberated with party members first, adding that UMNO might be accused of trying to take over the Yang di-Pertuan Agong's power if the party decides the date for the GE themselves. And moving on, the Ministry of Education has announced several improvements on the implementation of sports and co-curricular activities under the School Management and Operation Guidelines 3.0. These guidelines were issued following the decision to allow physical sports and activities outside classrooms involving individuals or groups in school compounds from March 21st onwards. Now, the MOE also allows sports activities and tournaments to be held within the school compound, but only teachers, coaches, and students from the school involved will be allowed to participate. Still keeping with SOPs as much as possible. Remember, we are still in a pandemic phase. We will be transitioning to an endemic phase, and therefore more SOPs will need to be adhered to. Now, Malaysia has recorded 27,000 new COVID-19 cases just yesterday, bringing the total number of infections to 3,927,437 since the pandemic began. There are currently close to 300,000 active cases in the country. And on the vaccination drive in the country, 65.6% of the adult population have received the booster dose and 97.5% have been fully vaccinated, while 98.7% received at least one dose of the vaccine. Well, where kids are concerned, 34.4% of kids have been successfully inoculated under PIC Kids, and that is the vaccination program for children. It's time to bring in my guest for today, Dr. HELMY MYDIN, to talk a little bit about a memorandum in support of the Minister of Health. Doctor, welcome back on board. It's good to see you again. Over 100 healthcare NGO and medical practitioners want members of parliament to support and pass the proposed tobacco and smoking control bill when that is to be tabled at the Dewan Rakyat. Now, the proposed bill is often touted as the generational endgame strategy. This was mooted by the health minister earlier this year in January to ban the sale of possession of tobacco and vape products as well for those born in 2005 or later. So, Doctor, perhaps you can walk us through what the generational endgame really means at this point.
Thanks, Jessy, and I'm glad to be back. I think, as you pointed out, this is something whereby we are trying or we are aiming to ban sales of tobacco products or smoking products to those born above or after the year 2005. And this is one of many policies that will hopefully be in the Tobacco Act, which, as you mentioned just now, YB Khairi will be presenting to Parliament later this year. And the idea behind the generational endgame is really to ultimately reduce the prevalence of smoking in the country. And I think we probably don't have enough time to go through all the really nasty, bad things that cigarettes and tobacco and smoking can do to us. But ultimately is to improve the lives of the rakyat and also to actually decrease the economic costs that we are currently bearing as a consequence of all this prevalence in terms of smoking and tobacco use.
Right. When we look at this issue, I mean, we know this is something strategy and campaign after campaign has tried to deal with. But with the health minister now mooting this idea, what did he really base it on? Apart from, as you said, all the bad things that we know smoking brings of, is it based on particular stats or best practices in other countries, perhaps?
It's a combination of things. So as I mentioned just now, and as you pointed out, the aim is to reduce smoking, right? And one fixed way of doing it is not going to be applicable to everyone. There are different ways or different strategies that we can use to address different pockets of the population. So for your die-hard smokers who want to quit but can't quit, we need to be able to provide adequate quit smoking tools to help them quit. But for those who have not started and those who have not been addicted to nicotine, which is one of the most addictive substances known to humankind, then we need to put in measures to reduce the ability of them to actually gain access to these products and also reduce the ability or rather the risk of them being addicted in terms of marketing gimmicks. So things like plain packaging, for example, things like ensuring that there is a limitation to how the products are actually displayed in shops, in retail places, and also in terms of the generational endgame. These are all measures that will be put in place in order to reduce the risk of people starting. And this is something that we see in various forms, not only in Malaysia, but in countries like New Zealand, Australia, and the United Kingdom as well.
Right. So, Doctor, with this plea or appeal from you and the fraternity, what is the gist of it all? And is this a reflection of perhaps some will lacking in terms of pushing the bill forward?
I think it's very encouraging that what we are doing is something that is encouraged and is supported by the vast majority of not just the medical fraternity, but lots of NGOs that are actually from socio-economic backgrounds. So this tells you that there is support in terms of the evidence behind it, the support in terms of the spirit behind it, and this is something that I don't think necessarily reflects the lack of ambition or will on the part of the government, but it is an additional tool to show that, you know what, this is something that is well expected. It is something that all the people are actually wanting to push forward. And it's going to be something that can be used in terms of pushing the message outwards. Because when it comes to the narrative, when it comes to, in some ways, defending ourselves against propaganda from those invested interests, it is very, very helpful to have independent, objective people supporting what we're trying to do in terms of policy making.
Right. There has always been some amount of blowback or repercussions when it comes to dealing with the cigarette boys. Will the minister have to deal with this influential lot? Perhaps even look at some sort of initiating some sort of cigarette alternatives, perhaps?
I think there will always be propaganda. I saw that the next guest is going to talk about propaganda, so I'll be quite interested to see how that is very similar to the misinformation and disinformation that we are currently seeing when it comes to tobacco and smoking. And this is something that, yes, we are very, very much aware of, because the manner in which those with vested interests try to derail tobacco control measures is very, very much, something that is replicable and something that we see globally. So whatever we have seen in terms of tactics, in terms of misinformation, in terms of flooding the media with information that may appear to be contrary to what we're trying to do, these are the things that we need to arm ourselves against. And once again, the memorandum that was shared by those groups of NGOs become very helpful, because it tells us once again that it's not just something that is, we didn't pick it out of the hat. I mean, it's not something that we're just doing without much thinking, but it's being done after much look into the evidence and after a lot of engagement, not just with patients, but with practitioners, healthcare workers, and even people from industry.
Right. In fact, an international study has found that if Malaysia fails to curb smoking, the government will stand to lose 273.5 billion ringgit due to cases like premature deaths and employees being absent due to poor health. Of course, that will affect their productivity, so on and so forth. So, Doctor, with all of this now moving forward, how can all of us support the Minister of Health?
I think one, I would say for the smokers out there, this is not something that is meant to be punitive. It is meant to be supportive. So if you do want to quit, there are ways to quit. There are ways that we're going to help our future generation, our children, from not smoking. And I think making our voices heard, because the silent majority appear to be very much in favor. So making your voices heard, being supportive of this, I think will be very helpful, because it will tell our members of parliament that this is something that the Rakyat wants.
Doctor, thanks for your time, and we look forward to speaking to you again.
Thank you, Jessy.
Well, of course, internationally as well, Denmark has considered a ban on cigarette sales to anyone born after the year 2010. We will keep you updated with more as this story develops and unfolds. Let's move on to business in brief right now. The ringgit opened flat against the US dollar today, remaining unchanged despite oil prices surging amidst Russian supply concerns. As of 9:20 a.m. today, $1 is 4 ringgit 19 cents. And at the Bursa, it opened marginally higher against markets, turning volatile following the United States Federal Reserve's aggressive interest rate and the surge in oil prices due to supply shortage concerns. At 9:05 a.m., the FBM KLCI was 0.35 of a point higher at 1591.22. The market bellwether opened 2.80 points better at 1593.68. And locally, short-term rates are expected to remain stable today on Bank Negara's operations to absorb surplus liquidity from the financial system. Liquidity is estimated at 43.76 billion ringgit in the conventional system and 20.02 billion ringgit in Islamic funds. And the central bank will conduct a 1 billion ringgit conventional market, a 3 billion ringgit in card Islamic range, and a 205 million ringgit reverse repo tender. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement has come into force today, paving the way for the country to integrate into the world's largest free trade agreement. According to the agreement, it will enable Malaysia to enjoy a global trade and investment ecosystem benefiting from eventual elimination of 90% of tariff among members and many more. All three of Wall Street's major indexes closed higher at more than 1% yesterday, with the Federal Reserve's path for interest rate hikes and worries over Russian default after creditors received payment receipts. Now, investors were reassured that for the time being, Russia will have averted its first external bond default in a century. Well, speaking of Russia and Ukraine, go online and you'll see many articles on the Russian propaganda. But according to Pete NICOLL, it's a well-oiled machine on both sides. So how do we make sense of all of this? How can I reconcile with who the bad guy is here? Probably a question we need to sit and ponder and ask ourselves. But it's time to bring in Peter NICOLL, our crisis management analyst, to weigh in a little bit. Pete, thanks for doing this. Our Teh Tarik conversations, Pete, now include by almost default the war and other common questions that are usually this. Is America instigating this? Who is behind it? What does Russia really want? What is the end game? Or, with the EU, what's their problem? Why is NATO just standing on the sidelines, Pete? We've even seen memes and all sorts of, comical satire about this. So give us a better idea of what is really going on.
Hi, Jessy. It is very complicated, as we can expect with most of these types of situations, but this one particularly because of the level of cyber capability within Russia, within Ukraine, and also within the West. One of the things that we have to be careful with here is that we don't demonize Putin, because that actually plays into his hands and actually suggests that perhaps the West doesn't really understand him as much as they think. Putin is not the devil. He's in fact a very calculated, ruthless, strategic expert. Continually ignored in his concerns regarding Russia's border security in the face of NATO expansion. But at the same time, he has used this as an excuse to try and show Russian military power and to resolve obviously the issue of the breakaway Donbass region in southern Ukraine, where there's been basically a civil war between Ukraine and Russian separatists since 2014. But the reality is that this is most definitely a showdown between Russia and the NATO alliance. Whether NATO alliance actually becomes physically involved in this is still up for question, but it is a showdown between the two entities in this conflict, Jessy.
Right, Pete. We just spoke to our guests before bringing you in, Dr. Helmy, who also talked a little bit about propaganda. And he said, it would, of course, mean or involve two elements, misinformation and disinformation as well. But at this point here with Russia, Ukraine, and all other, sides, what is a propaganda bubble? And how do we spot this on both sides of the divide? Perhaps you can also walk us through the different types of disinformation present here.
Sure, with pleasure. Propaganda bubbles are generated by governments or media or individuals to promote a very specific level of information with which to influence public opinion in favor of their own particular strategy or viewpoint, or to displace or disavow propaganda or information that is coming from the other side. They tend to promote information that is attractive to a particular sector of society and to generate influence for their own strategies or opinions. And it's really designed to make people take sides. So when we look at propaganda bubbles, we can think in terms of phrases that we're familiar with, such as fake news. And they're often described as deception, deflection, we obviously have two very powerful propaganda bubbles in play, with significant expertise on both sides, as we said, through their known cyber capabilities. And this, of course, been taken up by state media in Russia and Western media to present their own narrative in a lot of instances. As analysts, we normally work the rule of three. That is, three independent sources that can verify or discount an event before it is considered as part of their analysis. And there's also a number of red flags that we look for, such as wording that states this cannot be verified at this time, or it has been reported, or a source has advised. That tends to lead us to suggest that there is something there, but it's not maybe as factual as is being presented. But I think one of the really interesting things in this, Jessy, is a Ukrainian president, Zelensky, his superb use of social media with obviously a pro-Ukrainian propaganda drive, but he's managed to get this out to a huge global audience. And I'm absolutely sure that
denying that he has used the strength and advantage of social media, whereas on the other side as well, it can get quite confusing for social media users when they're bombarded with all sorts of different information, i.e. fake news, misinformation, propaganda, deflection, lies, so on and so forth. Peter, I'm going to pull up a map right now, pull up a map here. Tell me, how far have the Russian troops come? What can we read as to what will come as well? We just want to keep this map on screen as well. If the studio could bring that up at this point to let us know exactly what we're looking at in terms of movements, Pete.
In context, Jessy, Ukraine is Europe's largest country. And as you can see, Russia has in fact made significant advances across the south, the east. In the south, it appears that the attacks coming from Crimea and from Russia into southern and southeastern Ukraine have linked up at Mariupol, which is the objective. And this will now move on towards the western south city of Odessa. And with that corridor then basically landlocks Ukraine. They have no access to the Azov Sea or to the Black Sea, and that has a huge economic impact. In the north, the drive has been across towards Kiev. And what we're seeing is that there now appears to be an isolation of major towns which Russia can attack at its own convenience. And clearly Putin's forces are obviously being met with very stiff resistance wherever they are attacking. But there appears to be a different strategy now coming into play at this phase, which seems to be to isolate major cities and towns, shell those urban centres into submission, rather than just attack with ground force populations, and of course the government of Ukraine particularly when the number of civilian casualties will inevitably rise because of that strategy.
Peter, there's also quite a few questions about Malaysians in Russia at this point. With the sanctions and all, does it affect Malaysians there?
Yes, I mean, the negative impact of sanctions isn't just restricted to those on whom the sanctions are imposed, but also on those who are implementing them. So, apart from the issues like global price increases in the energy sector that everybody's saying, everybody's now bracing for an increase in the cost of food products, particularly with raw materials from Ukraine and Russia, which are the start of the supply chain and for many reasons are now stopped. Specifically for Malaysians in Russia, they're bound to beginning to feel the effects of these sanctions, particularly in terms of money transfers, etc. But the international banking corridors to transferring money to and from Russia are still working. You can still and Sberbank and other sanctioned banks, but it is becoming increasingly difficult. As major changers, Western Union, MoneyGram, Wise, PayPal, have now suspended all trading with Russia. So it's going to be difficult for Malaysians in Russia for the foreseeable future.
Pete, thank you for your insights and perspective. That was Peter NICOLL, Crisis Management Analyst. Let's move on to international news at this point of time. The WHO is seeking to provide psychological support to Ukrainian refugees, becoming Europe's fastest growing refugee crisis since World War II. According to the World Health Organization, while essential necessities are being covered, there's also an urgent need for psychological support. While they are being welcomed with aid, possibility of temporary residence, and access to employment around Europe, many are leaving the male members of their families behind to fight, tearing families apart as the war sees no end at this point. Meanwhile, the South African president blames NATO for the war in Ukraine, stating that he will resist calls to condemn Russia, casting doubt on whether he will be accepted by Ukraine or the West as a mediator. He believes the war could have been avoided if NATO heeded warnings from its own leaders and officials over the years that its eastward expansion would lead to instability in the region. This is a view shared by Putin. South Africa previously announced that it was asked to mediate in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Well, still with the conflict, the Kremlin says a possible peace deal with Ukraine is in the process that could swiftly stop the Russian military operation there. Kremlin remarks that the US has no right at this point to criticize Russia, considering the US long history of involvement in so many conflicts. Russia had the funds necessary to service its foreign bonds, so any default would be entirely artificial. Meanwhile, in Hong Kong, the city is experiencing an influx of dogs abandoned, with over 100,000 of its residents which have left the city unable to withhold its zero tolerance policy. Tough quarantine requirements have led airlines to cut down numbers of flights to and from Hong Kong, making it difficult for pet owners to bring their pets along. Many chose to abandon their pets, overwhelming dog shelters, which are already running at full capacity. And just yesterday, thousands of union members and workers demonstrated in Paris, calling the government to increase salaries as the country faces higher energy prices and inflation. Purchasing power has become a main preoccupation of voters above immigration and security, forcing presidential candidates to address this issue. With a presidential election looming next month, the government already capped gas and power price increases while offering financial assistance to low-income households to cope with the high cost of living. And a 2-year absence due to the pandemic, the annual New York City St. Patrick's Day parade made its return this week on Thursday. This parade drew visitors from not only across the US, but from all around the world. Manhattan's Fifth Avenue turned green as crowds surrounded marching bands, performers, and even politicians walking to celebrate Irish heritage. And on social media, here's a quick look at what's trending on Twitter today. All eyes on the UMNO General Assembly, hiking UMNO trending topic of discussion among netizens. That hashtag is, of course, hashtag UMNO. And onto badminton, All England 2022 is back on the list as it nears its end this Sunday, as Malaysia's Lee Zijia, Pearly Tan, Tina Muralidharan, Tan Kian Ming, and Lai Peng Jing continue their battles on court. That hashtag All England 2022. Well, this brings me to the end of today's edition of The Brief. Thanks for being with us all week and look forward to bringing you more updates and news and conversations next week. Till then, take care.